Mortals often look to the heavens when they tell stories of evils and iniquities, conjuring tales of the dastardly Daedra or the harsh judgment of the divines. But in reality, the most egregious displays of cruelty are almost always carried out by mortals themselves. Yes, they may dress up their genocides and betrayals with conveniently just motivations, but when stripped bare, the things mortals will do for land or power or wealth will make even the most malevolent monsters skin crawl. Of all the vile wickedness to take place in Tamriel's long and intricate history, there is one crime against mortality that stands out above all the others. This was no genocide, nor was it particularly bloody, but over the span of centuries, one race suffered a kind of sadistic torture that would impress even the Prince of Domination and Enslavement Molag Bal himself. This race is the Snow Elves, or to the modern folk of Skyrim, you may know them by their new moniker, the Falmer. Hey guys, it's Drew here and welcome back to FudgeMuppet. In this video we're going to explore the horrific history behind the blind, hunchbacked savages most adventurers would remember only as a pesky plight. While their poisoned arrows and Chorus Chitin blades may be infuriating to tomb raiders and fortune seekers, they were not always this barbarous. By the end of this video you may think twice next time you see one of these primitive creatures, because the circumstances of their transformation is nothing short of harrowing. Before the Falmer existed on Tamriel, the Snow Elves lived peacefully and in prosperity in Skyrim. The terrain was perfect for them, and when the early Aldmer spread out from the Somerset Isles early in the Malefic era, they were the only race of Mer with any interest in inhabiting such a bitter and desolate land. The Dwemer would soon come to occupy the caverns beneath the frosts, but above ground, Skyrim was for the Snow Elves. In modern times we always refer to the dwarves when speaking of advanced civilizations, but the truth is, for the time, the Snow Elves were forging a mighty empire. But alas, by the time the Malefic era drew to a close, all of the Snow Elves' affluence would count for naught, as they entered a conflict they could not win. The Atmorans, led by the legendary Isgramor, landed on the shores of Skyrim from their northern continent of Atmora. Initially this was handled peacefully by the Snow Elves. The two races coexisted amicably for some time. However, tensions grew with time, and one fateful day, everything erupted into chaos and conflict. The Proto-Nords operated from their capital city of Sarfal, and on the Night of Tears the Snow Elves unleashed a military onslaught on the city, attempting to drive the Atmorans from Skyrim once and for all. Thousands of years between the modern day and the Night of Tears has obscured the lens of history somewhat, and the motives behind this attack is relatively blurred. Commonly held theories on motive include fear, territorial disputes, military provocations, religious differences, and all of the typical excuses for mortals to slaughter one another. But the true motivation lies in the secret power the Atmorans discovered, beneath the city of Sarfal. If you watched our recent video on the Heart of Lorkhan, you'll know that the Mer of Tamriel have a rather unhealthy obsession with immortality or ascendance. Well, this artifact discovered by the men is called the Eye of Magnus, and belonged to the god of magic, Magnus himself. Magnus was the architect who helped realise Lorkhan's vision of creating Mundus. He is of particular importance to the elves as he had the power to transcend from Mundus back to Aetherius, the realm of the Aedra. Just as the Dwemer would someday meddle with a divine relic in an attempt to embrace immortality, the Snow Elves' ambition became their martyrdom, and they flew too close to the sun. The Nords, less corrupted by the prospect of godhood, vowed to prevent the Snow Elves from tapping the power of the Eye. While the Snow Elves were successful on the Night of Tears, Isgramor and his two sons survived. They returned to Atmora, and returned with a force 500 strong. Their vengeful cleansing of Skyrim led to the butchery of thousands of Snow Elves. After this victory, the Nords kept the Eye of Magnus buried far beneath Sarfal, out of reach for power-hungry Mer. The Nords were incessant in their sweep over Skyrim. They culled every Snow Elf in sight, replacing every unoccupied settlement with Nords. The cleansing of Skyrim lasted for years, and the Snow Elves were forced to evacuate their native land. It is believed that some of the Snow Elves found a respite in the Forgotten Vale, but for most of the race, the only viable escape from the ceaseless slaughter was to skulk into the darkness, deep down in the domain of the Dwemer. This truly was a last resort to the Snow Elves, who had historically lived rich, fulfilled lives under the gaze of the sun and the winds of winter. The elves braced for one final stand in the Mosring Mountains of Solstheim, but there the Snow Prince was slain, and the last hope of this race was cast down beneath the might of the Nords and one grief-stricken girl. This is where the frightful fate of the Snow Elves truly begins. An entire race of refugees deprived of their home and their freedom, treading the precarious path into the dwarven citadel of Blackreach. The Dwemer were kind enough to offer them a haven when they had nowhere else to turn, but this industrious people would not provide such solace without a price, a hefty price. The Snow Elves would become bound in servitude, allowed to live among the Dwemer so long as they became little more than slaves. But service alone was not enough. The dwarves had no intention of allowing the Snow Elves enough slack on their leash to run the risk of revolt. No, the Snow Elves were instead subjugated to the compulsory consumption of a toxic fungus which grew within the confines of Blackreach. Many of the elves did not submit to this willingly. Splinter factions of brave defectors sought alternatives, attempting to make alliances elsewhere or even fighting their way to freedom. But they had nowhere to turn. Return to the surface and face the wrath of Ysgramor's men, or stay submerged in Dwemer territory and accept their terms. Over time, the noxious effects of the fungus took hold on the Snow Elves, and their sight diminished. The newly blind race were not so well adapted to permanent darkness as the Falmer we see today, and they were clumsy and impotent. The Dwemer kept this particular mushroom as a staple in the diet of the elves to ensure that not only they remain blind, but their lineage will suffer the same deformities. Any chance of a Snow Elf uprising was well and truly done by this point, and the dejected slaves had two choices: obey or perish. By this time, the dwarves were already well established as engineering and architectural geniuses, but it must have been quite an asset to have an entire race of blind vassals doing all of their dirty work. To this day, scholars debate the details of the subsequent transformation the Snow Elves made during their captivity. Some say the Dwemeri toxins were so potent that blindness was only the first effect of consumption. From there, the poison took hold in their very physiology, and they devolved into the savage, stunted beasts we see today in the Fourth Era. Others suggest that the transition came about due to unnatural living conditions. They claim that the cramped spaces, the absence of the sun's nourishment, and the slave rations were enough to gradually corrupt the Snow Elves into the hideous offspring known as the Falmer, or the betrayed to the surviving Snow Elves of the Forgotten Vale. Knight Paladin Gelibor, one of the surviving Snow Elves from the Vale, summed up the great betrayal with the following words: "We had always maintained an uneasy alliance with the underground-dwelling dwarves, and when faced with extinction we turned to them for help. Surprisingly, they agreed to protect us but demanded a terrible price: the blinding of our race. There were splinter groups that resisted the agreement, and even some that sought alternate alliances. But when it was all said and done, those elves were either slaughtered, vanished, or gave up and took the dwarves' bargain." With all of that said, the unimaginable horrors undergone by the Snow Elves proved their resilience in a sense. Over the centuries they adapted and survived. Now these blind savages boast heightened senses, and in their own primitive way they actually have a functioning society. But how did these dejected degenerates ever escape the tyranny of the dwarves? Well, generations after the initial enslavement of the betrayed, the slaves rose up and rebelled against their captives, despite all the odds. For decades, the oppressed Snow Elves waged war with the dwarves. Details of this conflict are nigh impossible to find, as this all took place deep beneath the ground. But the fighting came to an abrupt end in the 700th year of the First Era, not by any special effort of the slaves, but due to an occurrence in Morrowind. The Battle of Red Mountain between the Chimer and the Dwemer provoked Kagranak, the chief tonal architect of the dwarves, to use his tools on the heart of Lorkhan. He meddled with powers far too potent for mortal hands, and the Dwemer race in its entirety disappeared in the blink of an eye. It's quite ironic really. The downfall of the Snow Elves came about due to similar circumstances. They were greedy for power and spilled blood in hopes of acquiring the Eye of Magnus, only they never had the chance to tamper with the artifact. Maybe, had Ysgramor not returned with his 500 companions, the Snow Elves would have achieved something similar, vanishing from Tamriel like the Dwemer. But no, here they stand, the sudden victors of a war they fought blind. The glorious underground empire of the Dwemer in Skyrim now belonged to the Falmer. Had they still been Snow Elves, this would have been the perfect opportunity to return their prosperity. But centuries of ingesting poison and serving as slaves meant they were incapable of utilising the advanced technologies at their disposal. Their minds had deteriorated so drastically that they could do little more than squat among the architecture, build chitinous camps and crafting primitive weapons, all beneath the watchful gaze of dormant dwarven centurions, steam-bellowing spheres, and skittering spiders. Despite their deficiencies, the Falmer have domesticated the large insects named Chorus. They are bred as allies and used for naturally brewing poisons, and eventually killed and harvested for their formidable chitinous shells. With the expanses of the Dwemer cities free to explore, it was only a matter of time before the Falmer returned to the surface and rekindled their spark of animosity with the Nords. Thousands of years after the arrival of the Atmorans, those pale-skinned elves are still pestering them. According to the Pocket Guide to the Empire, Nords attribute almost any misfortune or disaster to the machinations of the Falmer, or Snow Elves, be it crop failure, missing sheep, or a traveller lost crossing a high pass. And they would be right in their accusations. It is said that the Falmer have but one base desire in their primal brains, and that is to destroy the surface world and any who live above. Whether there is any motive behind their actions is mostly conjecture, as it seems more likely that the Falmer are simply demented savages. Granted, they can fashion tools and traps, but attributing a rationale to them isn't so far detached from claiming the giant who clobbered you into orbit did it because he didn't like the cut of your jib. Chances are a creature attacks because it wants to eat you, rob you, or protect its territory. In fact, the Falmer are just as happy to assault Snow Elves in the rare instances where the two races come face to face. Unfortunately, it seems that there is no hope left for the legacy of the Snow Elves. The Falmer are broken and twisted beyond repair, and when the last remaining Snow Elves of the Forgotten Vale die, they will be all that's left of this once prosperous race. Whether you sympathise with the Atmorans after the Night of Tears, or with the Snow Elves who were served harsh justice in the aftermath, there is no denying just how awful the centuries spanning the end of the Malefic era and the beginning of the First Era must have been for the Snow Elves, especially those who played no part in the fight for the Eye of Magnus. Dragged down into the darkness only to be poisoned and enslaved, this race had the potential to build an empire that would last the ages, but instead, the only remnants of their legacy have been forgotten. I hope you enjoyed my rendition of the story of the Snow Elves and the Falmer. If you did, a like would be immensely appreciated. Thanks so much for watching everyone, my name is Drew, and I will see you later.